Hand traps are some of the most controversial cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! They often receive criticism and are acknowledged as a problem in the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game. But without hand traps, it would be safe to say that Yu-Gi-Oh! Would be almost unplayable because of how volatile it is. From iconic cards like Kuriboh to one of the most hated cards in the history of the game, Maxi, Konami has made numerous attempts to be able to fix their problems. But unfortunately, that problem is yet to be solved. In this video, we're going to talk about how hand traps have failed to accomplish their main goal, and why Yu-Gi-Oh! Players hate them because of this. Let's go ahead and jump on in. Now, in order to understand hand effects and why they can be so problematic in Yu-Gi-Oh!, we must first understand their origin and their initial design. Hand effects, better known as hand traps, were by design built to be able to bridge the gap between spells, traps, and monsters. You see why monsters' primary job is to reduce your opponent's life points to 0, spell cards were supposed to enhance your monsters, and trap cards were supposed to stop those monsters. There are oftentimes a breakdown in the core fundamentals in Yu-Gi-Oh! Which can feel unfair. For example, if there was a situation where a player were able to summon a ton of monsters or very powerful monsters to their side of the field, and trap cards weren't sufficient enough to ensnare them, that would be a major problem. It would oftentimes leave a situation where things can feel luck-based if your opponent got the appropriate cards, take for example, Heavy Storm or Harpy's Feather Duster to get rid of those traps, or if your opponent went first, meaning that your trap cards weren't as effective. Now, the reason why I use that very clear example is because that is the initial design of hand traps. They were supposed to be a balancing act between not only going first and second, they were also supposed to add another layer to the game and provide a clear and defined Yu-Gi-Oh! Role that players would enjoy. Hand traps are often very weak in stats and typically can't stand on their own, but the flip side of them is that their effects are almost invincible because there's very few cards that can stop them. They were very much brought on to be a defensive utility type card, and you can actually see that in the beginning eras. While Kuriboh, being the very first and honorary hand trap, failing miserably outside of Yugimoto using it inside of the show, it shows clear-cut the intention of these particular cards and how they could be useful in the correct situations. In a perfect world, hand traps are closer to Kuriboh. They are incredibly balanced because for a player going first, this is almost useless. But as you start to get into the deeper stages of the game, and if an unfair card is being used, it is a card that could potentially save you. And as you start to look at the duel monsters in the GX era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, hand traps at best are that, and at worst are experimental. Now, cards like Gravekeeper's Commandant and Harpy Queen could be considered the first versions of hand traps. There's some of the very few monsters that can be used from the hand, but the first time Konami got it right was with DD Crow, a powerful monster that addressed the current Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game. You see, another important thing about hand traps is that they're like a utility belt. Oftentimes when the game gets too fast, Konami introduces these type of cards to be able to curb the current situation. There's no mistake that DD Crow came out around a time where cards like Treeborn Frog and Destiny Hero Malicious were incredibly popular, and even still to the very core, DD Crow is only a defensive card. It can genuinely only be used against a player to stop their ongoing momentum, and its relatively weak stats kept it from being a must-play outside of the situations that were required. The GX era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Was incredible at addressing those type of situations. Monsters like Honest and Gores were introduced to be able to curb heavy removal and incredibly strong monsters. Honest even gave a theme to, at the time, an underserved attribute, as well as it giving a huge boost to a plethora of decks. And Gores being the very first hand trap to almost unanimously be played in every single Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategy, but also not being an overbearing card. Gores is the perfect example of hand effects, bridging the gap if there's a breakdown between monsters, spells, and traps, while also being a card that can only be used if you are in a losing situation. On top of that, there was an extra layer of competitiveness that made Gores such a brilliant card. Since the card existed in just about everyone's deck, you had to prepare yourself for Gores, and it wasn't in a way that was oppressive. It was a way that skillfully rewarded players for playing around the card, while also could potentially punish players for getting a little too greedy. You can even say that the 5Ds era doubled down on this type of sentiment. With monsters like Kalut, Blackwing of Shadow, and Battle Fader, battle hand traps were incredibly important in Yu-Gi-Oh! At the time where the battle phase was everything. Konami saw how there was a power creep going towards the battle phase in really strong monsters and sought to address it. But that doesn't mean that they were ignorant to any other problems in the game. In this era, one of the most popular hand traps that's still being used today was born. Effect Veiler showed a huge shift to how hand traps worked. Being a card that could stop an opponent's monster effect was very important at this point in time of the game. Monster effects were starting to become really powerful and needed some type of restriction when players went first. And Effect Veiler is a perfect balance to that particular situation. Cards like Effect Veiler and even Droll and Lockbird, a card that also came out during that time, were a perfect balance for the type of situation that Yu-Gi-Oh! Was in. And the best thing about these cards is that while they could be used together, they didn't necessarily function very well together. Effect Veiler doesn't typically play a lot of significance if you need your Gore's Emissary of Darkness's effect, and you're not really worried about the effects of DD Crow when you're trying to use your monsters to battle so you can use Honest. This was a smooth cohesion of Konami using hand traps to be able to address power creep. But unfortunately, that changes when their philosophy changes inside of the Zexal era. Now, the Zexal era is known for speeding up Yu-Gi-Oh! Even faster than what Synchros were. The pacing of this format demands key timing and attention to detail. One of the most popular formats inside of the Exceed era is the Tengu Plant era, which is really important. This era of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is regarded to one of the best eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! Of all time, and a lot of players say it's even better than Edison. Unfortunately, during this time period, power creep did jump up significantly. Players were able to special summon monsters in mass, creating situations where there were incredibly strong monsters on the turn 1. Konami addresses this by releasing a card called Max C. If you know enough about Yu-Gi-Oh!, play Master Duel and the OCG, you probably think Max C is one of the worst cards to happen in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s existence. In actuality, Max C could be considered one of the most hated cards in Yu-Gi-Oh!'s history, and I would be pretty interested in making a video talking about Max C in particular. Of course, Big Dog, if that's something you want to see, go ahead and let me know down below. But the irony here at this point in time, Max C is not as powerful as you guys would think. In the Exceed era, there are a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies that are special summoning a lot, but Max C just so happens to be a card to help deal with them. Ironically, throughout most of the Exceed era, Max C is one of the most balanced cards, as there are a myriad of decks and situations where Max C can be completely useless. But here's an important part because it shows a change of philosophy. Max C is the very first hand trap that can be activated almost at will. If we go back to the beginning of the video where we talked about Karibo being one of the worst hand traps of all time, to monsters like Gores and Honest requiring specific timing, or even cards like Effect Veiler and DD Crow addressing a very particular situation, Max C breathed a whole different era or the usage of a hand trap. And it wasn't fully explored until we get into a massive power creep era, like the Pendulum era. The Pendulum era is something that I talk about in depth in one of my videos, explaining why everyone hates pendulums. I do the same thing with Link monsters because they play a huge role, but during this era in Yu-Gi-Oh!, special summoning becomes way more important. Unlike the Zexal era where there is a balance between strong strategies that don't need to special summon a lot and dead times where Max C isn't as powerful, the Link in the Pendulum era doesn't have many strategies that are powerful that accommodate those particular situations. In order to help use hand traps to combat this particular era, Konami releases 2 hand traps, Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit, as well as Psyframe Gear Gamma, cards that really don't pick up a lot of traction initially. So towards the end of the era, Konami decides to double down on cards that are closer towards the Max C style of hand trap than the Honest, the Gores, and the Kaluts. Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring, as well as Infinite Impermanence, do make their debut in different eras, but they are close enough together to be considered hand traps that came out roughly at the same time. While these particular cards technically have restrictions, since pretty much 100% of Yu-Gi-Oh! Strategies either add from the deck to the hand, special summon from the deck, or send to the graveyard, or even activate monster effects, these cards are closer to Max C than they are to some of the others. This creates a powerful combination where Max C's abilities are realized. You see, these particular hand traps came out because the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game was so fast and it was built to slow players down and give an advantage to players going second. But if a particular player just so happens to go first and has these cards in their hand, it is completely unfair. Not only would Maxi enable you to draw these cards a little bit more often, because your opponent is more than likely forced to special summon as many times as you want to, it would often give you enough cards to be able to destroy or obliterate your opponent's board. With power creep going through the roof and battle hand traps being completely useless, there was no counterbalancing to this particular style of play. And this is exactly what Yu-Gi-Oh has became. Now, Konami does try to curb this particular situation by not only banning Maxi, but introducing other niche hand traps into the game. Cards like Ghost Mourner and Moonlit Chill and Ghost Bell and Haunted Mansion are very specific hand traps that typically, because of their niche effects and the huge requirement of cards you had to play to make your deck consistent, weren't often considered. Nibiru and Dimension Shifter were then later introduced to help solve other problems in the game, but this proved to be one of Konami's biggest mistakes. You see, the biggest thing is that Konami never really addressed the power creep issue. They continued to make strategy stronger and stronger and used hand traps as a band-aid. Konami's hand traps were no longer cards like Gores and Battle Fader, which could shift the tide from a losing situation into a more even playing field, and were more like cards that could be used to not only hinder a player from going first, but if you got the advantage of going first and had these cards and your opponent didn't, it could be incredibly bad for a player. This essentially did the exact opposite on what these cards were designed to do, to bridge the gap between monsters, spells, and traps. And unfortunately, it only exacerbated the situation. I like to say that at this point in time in Yu-Gi-Oh, we're in a situation called critical mass, because with the steady increase with power creep, we were bound to experience something like Maxi or an inverse effect, which unfortunately, we received both of those at the same time. Like I said earlier, Maxi was used to be able to accumulate as many resources as possible. That way you can throw every hand trap that you could at your opponent to slow them down. It's still the strategy being used in Master Duel and the OCG as of current. But now, because of power creep, Yu-Gi-Oh strategies also don't need to be as big as they once were in the past. Yu-Gi-Oh strategies, once requiring 28 pieces of their in-theme cards, now only need to play roughly half of those cards and only need one of them to be able to do their full combo. This means instead of 12 slots to play your cards that aren't a part of your strategy, cards that can help you defend against your opponent, you can play almost double those amount of cards, which just so happen to be hand traps. Combine that with Konami making the new Molcharmi series, almost introducing what we would call a balanced version of Maxi, you can only wonder how long it would take for these cards to hit critical mass with the hand effects we already have today.